So their view of North America was a regime of scarcity. And their view of human beings was not of pleasure, but their view of human beings was of guilt and shame that could be assuaged only by ceaseless labor. This was like a division in the European settlement of North America, of the Anglophone North America. And that story of Thomas Morton at Marymount, M-E-R-R-Y, Marymount, is a story that is rarely told in USA history. But I tell that story in order to introduce the theme of the green. To me, there are two sides to May Day, the green side and the red side. And the green side has to do with the earth and photosynthesis, chlorophyll, would that be right? And chlorophyll. The red side has to do with blood and struggle. One is of pleasure and fertility, a Neolithic holiday going back thousands of years, and the other going back to 1886, when it became a workers' holiday. And that story check out the cover. Isn't it lovely? Isn't it beautiful? You got 5 women there with their behinds right at you. Look at that. They're all short sleeves so that they can see what their hand is doing. If you bend over with long sleeves, you can't see so well. That's why they have short sleeves. And they're all wielding a sickle. Like, you know, the hammer and sickle. A sickle. The sickle makes you bend over. And you can't, or I can't do that very long. And I don't think anyone really wants to. I mean, try it, of course. So you might cut higher up on the stalk, you know, rather than get way down, higher up. You got that? Now you remember Deuteronomy, don't you? The Hebrew Scriptures, that you must not cut too close to the ground, but you must leave for the gleaners, the stranger, the orphan, the widow. This is sacred to all cultures in Neolithic agriculture. It's a safety net, an ancient safety net. And I'm saying this is part of the green. And we see it here among these women who are having a conversation with one another in their labor, as opposed to the scythe, where you stand up. As a beautiful, I can't do a scythe, but I've seen it done. And there's a beautiful rhythm to the scythe, and of course many dances come from this rhythm. But you don't have the choice about how close to the ground to cut with it. So this is, we were just learning about this. The PM Press was very deep. They pretended they didn't know anything about the origins of this painting. But as soon as we began to do some investigation, Brandon, we found it was key. Because the Haymarket Riot of 1886 began on May Day, 1886, on a movement for the 8-hour day of direct action. That is, you don't ask your representative, politician, labor representative, or police for permission to stop work, but after 8 hours you stop work and you leave the premises without so much as by your leave from the boss. But the boss brought in the police and shot 4 iron workers on the 1st of May in Chicago at the McCormick Works. And McCormick is the one who produced the Reaper Combine, who mechanized the labor that the women are doing here. So that to me was a story that I had never heard told anymore. That the detail of the labor process of the production of grain on the North American plains underwent these changes from 3 types of tools. And I wish David were here, Well, I'm sure there are other skilled Marxists here who could explain all this or describe it all in terms of constant and variable capital. But it's already global, you see, because this great productivity comes from this that undercuts the price of grain in Europe, undercutting their labor. They now become redundant because the grain that they produce is sold at a higher price than the grain that comes from the mechanization of the Great Plains of North America. This is the agricultural revolution, they call it, of the 1880s, when New Zealand and Australian meat and grain also comes to Europe. Anyway, this is a whole side to the Haymarket thing that I believe, Brandon, remains unexplored. And we can only do it now, and we can only think about it, because of the red and the green. That is, because we're thinking of the fertility of the earth, we're thinking of the ecology of our ecologies, because of the climate disasters and their epiphenomena that we're finding in species destruction, desertification, loss of forests, wildfires, tornadoes, and who knows what else lies ahead of us. But that green can only be restored, and the world can only be righted with a red struggle. And that red struggle requires making of a working class. That is a class that is able to defeat that class now, which is responsible for putting this world in such a hell of a fix. Now, was there something else I was going to say about these workers? No, I think I did that. Did you follow me? I mean, it's just, I've just started. I think it's sound, what I've said. I think so. Because otherwise, I'd see paintings like this and I just think of nostalgia. But when I started paying attention to it, it began to make increasing amounts of sense. Yeah. The incomplete, true, authentic. So this book is authentic because actually, as I was saying to Brandon, it's not a book about that I just wrote. These came from pamphlets that were written and dispersed sometimes just the week before May Day, from the 1980s onwards. And it was during the 80s that, I mean, I was suddenly thinking of the first essay, you know, the punch that wasn't. When we had this great festival of May Day, we started having May Day parties back in Rochester, New York, you know, in the early 80s. And we got into some trouble. And, you know, I lost my job as a result of it. And a wonderful guy from Chicago, a freight train we called him, Bob Harmon, wonderful historian, graduate student, was thrown out because of the red and the green at May Day, at a May Day party. So the first essay is about that, Brandon. So this was trying to recover, trying to keep the flag flying, Shahzad, in times when it wasn't anywhere in the U.S. The other incomplete part is the 2006 mobilizations in the USA of the Hispanic workers. But before doing that, can I collect the five that were passed around? Thanks to, I mean, unless you, is there another one?
No, you'll read it.
Oh, is it? Really? Oh, yeah. Well, the powers that be in the USA, they said, well, you can have a Labor Day, but it's going to be in September, you know, far away from May Day. So they wanted to separate the U.S. Now, it's true in Canada as well. And that particular story they don't tell in that book, but I don't want to criticize that book because I learned so much from it. So that's why the 1st of September is Labor Day, because they wanted to increase the chauvinism of the American working class. But then what did they do with May Day? Well, if you didn't know, May Day in the Haymarket, going back to 1886, some police were killed, and some anarchists were killed, and some demonstrators were killed. And at the Democracy Now! Interview, I think I got the casualty numbers wrong. I think I got a number of things wrong, just because I hadn't studied properly before the interview. But there were as many as 7 people were killed, I think, and many more wounded. Not as a result of the bomb, but of the fire, the fire of shooting that took place afterwards. Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, in the 1890s made Labor Day the 1st of September to separate it from worldwide. That separation is so important because the memory of May Day in Haymarket has been maintained in North America, but not in the USA and not in Canada. Maintained in Mexico, where May Day for decades was called the Day of the Martyrs. Nobody in the USA knows who the martyrs were, but they were all hanged. Albert Parsons, George Engel, Fisher, and August Spies. They were hanged on the 11th of November, 1887, despite a worldwide mobilization to prevent that from happening. And if David were here, we could carry on about the role of capital punishment and hanging within the pedagogy and the terrorist relation of the class struggle in the USA. Eisenhower, Cold War years. Cold War years were just hideous for May Day. The communist powers are going to celebrate May Day by having missiles paraded in Red Square. We don't notice you. And in the USA, Eisenhower said May Day will be called Law Day. And to this day, on May 1st, in law schools throughout the USA, they have cops come in and talk, prosecutors, or deacons, as if this was their day. It was, except for Michael Ratner, yeah. So that's the Law Day side. And isn't that disgraceful? The ignorance of us folks in the USA is produced. There's a new science called agnotology. You know this. It's the science of ignorance that the tobacco industry developed, of how to produce ignorance so that you don't think that nicotine is related to cancer. And they spent much money, and movies have been developed about how they did this. But it's not just over tobacco and cancer. The ignorance that's created in the United States is manufactured. It's created by, to use an Althusserian expression, by structures of the state ideological apparatus. Is that of colleges and universities and schools. Yeah. That wasn't so funny, was it? Well, anyway. So that's, now, our good friend from PN Press is willing to sell this to you, along with Stop Thief. And Stop Thief was recommended by David McNally, so there's nothing further I can do. And also, he might throw in, I don't know, you'll have to do negotiations, this Ned Ludd and Queen Mab. Do you know this? It's excellent. And here's why. You know Ned Ludd? Okay. You don't know Ned Ludd? Oh, well, good for you, brave person, for admitting that you don't know something. That is the foundation of knowledge. After my years of teaching, I came to realize that. And then you read Socrates and people like that, and they say, yeah, if you don't know something, then you can learn. Well, Yeah, Ned Ludd, I'm not sure anyone knows who Ned Ludd was. But he was the person who took the hammer to the machines in 1811. You know, you've probably heard of Luddites. At that same time, Shelley, the Romantic poet, talked about Queen Mab. That is an Irish queen, an Irish powerful queen. Anyways, the story of this Irish queen and Ned Ludd who destroyed the machines, and it's just a great, it's really good. It is. All here brought by Carl, and it's, you know, books are heavy. we thank his labor, and therefore for sale to you. Are there any questions? Brandon?
So I have a question, and it's about the anarchists in the bomb. So in the history of May Day, a lot of scholars, specifically historians, want to focus on whether the anarchists actually threw the bomb or not, or whether it was a provocateur. And as an anarchist, not as a scholar here, I want to say that's the wrong question to ask. That whether the anarchists threw the bomb or not, we should defend it for them. We should defend class anger. We should defend like our working class, like killing their bosses or killing the cops. Like this comes to other issues too. We've seen it in Canada around the Oka crisis and the debate of was the cop shot or not. And then this always takes up like a large amount of like our activity as like socialists, anarchists, and communists. But who cares if they threw a bomb at the cops? And I think it's a different kind of like argument. Like as a scholar, right? I think we can like look at it and try to see what we can get from the historical record. But as a socialist who wants to rebuild the class, as you were pointing out, that these are the kind of debates that don't help us. Because what we end up doing is pointing out who is a good worker, who is a bad worker, who is the right kind of like Mayday, who is the wrong kind of Mayday. And it's not the diversity and unity. It just becomes who do we police and how do we police it. So what do you think about like this large debate on who throws the bomb? And what kind of role does it take place in your work?
I try to skirt around it. And I talk about it privately. I don't advocate in public shooting police people. But like many people, I tend to keep score. You know, how many have been shot and killed by drones, by stray bullets, by the George Zimmermans, by vigilantes, by officers in blue, by officers in gray, by screws in prisons. I tend to keep track of that. I think 162. Well, I won't give any numbers. I'm not really a scholar on this kind of violence. Violence, did I say? I did. I think what I didn't describe to you in any of the books that we could read, and I'd like to quote Marty Glaberman, who said that the major, and I think I mentioned something like this at the beginning of today's talk, the major source of violence and terror in the world today comes from the USA, comes from the powerful military machine of the USA. And I think many of us are reluctant to excite the anger of that beast for fear of consequences. And yet, we must do something. We must challenge in some way. So my own thinking is just to remember the Stasi in East Germany, which when I grew up was always held to be the firmest, most steadfast police state in the world. And yet it collapsed, you know, in less than a year. And it collapsed from within. Now the rot that it produced is still there, for sure. So that's what I think also of the USA, that somehow it must, its terrorizing effects must be prodded and pushed to collapse from within. This was